The morning sun had barely peeked through the cloudy Detroit sky when the little girl woke up to the familiar ache in her stomach. She was used to being hungry by now, but today felt different. The kitchen cabinets stood empty, their doors slightly ajar like hungry mouths themselves. 3 days had passed since she'd eaten anything more than the few crackers her mother had managed to find in the back of the pantry. Her mother was already gone, rushing between her job as a morning cleaner at the local hospital and her evening shift at the diner. The girl could still smell her mother's discount store perfume lingering in the air, a scent that reminded her of better days when her father was still alive. Back then, their small apartment had always been filled with the aroma of home-cooked meals and the sound of laughter. Everything changed 6 months ago. Her father's sudden illness came like a storm, fierce and unforgiving. The hospital bills piled up faster than autumn leaves, and even with insurance, the costs were overwhelming. The day he passed away, he left behind more than just an empty space at the dinner table. He left them with a mountain of medical debt that seemed to grow taller with each passing month. The girl looked at her little brother, still sleeping peacefully on the worn-out couch they'd converted into his bed. He was too young to understand why their mother's eyes were always red from crying, or why they couldn't buy new shoes when their old ones got holes. She had been sharing her school lunches with him, carefully splitting each sandwich and apple into 2 portions. But yesterday, the school had closed for teacher training, and their kitchen had nothing left to offer. Walking to Wilson's corner store, she clutched her worn backpack close. The store had been there forever, its faded blue awning a familiar sight in their neighborhood. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she wandered the aisles, her stomach tightening at the sight of fresh bread and cheese. The prices seemed to mock her. Even the cheapest loaf cost more than what her mother had left in her emergency jar at home. The security cameras blinked their red eyes as she stood there, contemplating choices no child should have to make. Her father had always taught her that stealing was wrong, but he had also taught her to take care of her little brother. The weight of her empty backpack felt like a heavy reminder of their empty kitchen at home. In a moment of desperation, her small hands reached for a loaf of bread and a package of cheese. The movement was quick, almost unconscious, as if her hunger was making decisions for her. The items disappeared into her backpack, hidden beneath her folded jacket. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone in the store could hear it. Mr. Wilson, the store owner, had seen everything through the security monitor in his office. He recognized the girl, had watched her grow up, had known her father. He'd noticed how thin she'd become lately, how her once bright eyes now seemed dulled by worry. But times were tough for everyone, and he'd already lost too much inventory to theft this month. His own business was hanging by a thread, and he felt he had to take a stand. As the girl headed toward the door, her steps heavy with guilt, Mr. Wilson emerged from his office. His face was stern, but his eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. "I'm going to have to call the police," he said, his voice echoing through the nearly empty store. The girl didn't run or cry. She just stood there, her small shoulders slumping under the weight of her actions. The local police arrived quickly, treating the situation with an unexpected gentleness. Officer Chen had daughters of her own, and something about this case felt different from the usual shoplifting calls. But protocol was protocol, and soon the girl found herself caught in the machinery of the justice system, a system that would prove to be both her challenge and her unexpected salvation. Nobody in the store that morning could have predicted how this small act of desperation would ripple through their community, touching lives far beyond the confines of Wilson's corner store, and ultimately leading to a courtroom where even the most hardened hearts would be moved by what was about to unfold. The courthouse stood tall and imposing against the gray Detroit sky, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The little girl had never seen anything quite like it. Her mother squeezed her hand as they climbed those steps, each one feeling higher than the last. The building seemed to touch the clouds, making her feel even smaller than she already was. They arrived early that morning, their bus ride silent and tense. Her mother had borrowed a dress from their neighbor for her to wear, a simple blue thing with tiny white flowers, clearly meant for someone bigger. The sleeves kept sliding down her thin arms, and she had to roll them up again and again. Her mother had spent an hour the night before washing and pressing it, determined that her daughter would look presentable, despite their circumstances. Through a series of paperwork mix-ups and administrative errors, what should have been a straightforward juvenile case had somehow landed in Judge Richardson's criminal court. The judge, known throughout the city for his strict interpretation of the law, had been on the bench for over 2 decades. His courtroom was usually reserved for serious offenses, not cases involving hungry children and loaves of bread. The morning's proceedings had started normally enough. Drug possession cases, petty theft, the usual parade of adult offenders. But when the bailiff called out the next case, an unusual hush fell over the courtroom. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering over her stenotype machine as she double-checked the docket. The little girl's shoes, worn hand-me-downs from a church donation box, made soft squeaking sounds against the polished floor as she walked forward. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Several of the lawyers present exchanged confused glances. A young public defender shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his freshly pressed suit a stark contrast to his client's borrowed dress. Judge Richardson peered down from his bench, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His eyes, usually sharp with authority, softened almost imperceptibly as they fell upon the small figure before him. In his 20 years on the bench, he'd never had a defendant who barely reached the height of the witness stand. From the back of the courtroom came the quiet sounds of the girl's mother trying to hold back her tears. She sat with her hands tightly clasped, her work uniform partially hidden under a thin jacket. She'd had to beg her morning supervisor to let her attend the hearing, knowing she'd lose half a day's wages, money they desperately needed. The court clerk, a woman who had seen thousands of cases come and go, found herself having to clear her throat several times as she read out the charges. The formal legal language seemed almost absurd when applied to such a young defendant. In the matter of, she began, her voice wavering slightly before she steadied herself. The regular crowd of courthouse regulars, lawyers, bailiffs, and various civil servants, had stopped their usual hustle and bustle. Even the normally distracted court officers found themselves drawn to the unusual scene unfolding before them. A veteran prosecutor in the gallery quietly closed his case files, unable to focus on his upcoming cases. The judge's gavel, usually wielded with swift authority, remained untouched on his bench. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his usual stern demeanor giving way to something more paternal. The morning light filtering through the high windows caught the silver in his hair, and for a moment he looked less like the feared adjudicator of justice and more like someone's grandfather. As the little girl stood before the court, her small hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table, nobody present could shake the feeling that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The usual mechanical nature of the justice system seemed to pause, as if the very institution itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The story that was about to unfold in that courtroom would challenge not just the law, but the very hearts of everyone present. When asked to explain her actions, the little girl didn't start crying like everyone expected. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her oversized borrowed dress and pulled out a piece of paper. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had turned soft, like fabric. Even from his elevated bench, the judge could see that it was a hospital bill. The courtroom remained perfectly still as her small fingers carefully unfolded the document. She handled it with the kind of gentle care usually reserved for precious things, smoothing out each wrinkle with her palm against the wooden table. The sound of the paper crinkling seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed room. "My dad got sick," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "He used to be strong. He could lift me and my brother both at the same time." She paused, her eyes fixed on the bill in front of her. "But then he couldn't even lift himself out of bed." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. The court reporter's fingers hovered motionless over her machine. She'd recorded countless testimonies over the years, but something about this one made her afraid she might miss a single word. The public defender sat perfectly still, knowing that any intervention would break the spell that had fallen over the courtroom. The little girl continued, explaining how the hospital bills had piled up like mountains of paper on their kitchen table. Her mother had tried to hide them, but she'd seen the numbers, impossibly large figures that made her mother cry late at night when she thought the children were sleeping. After Dad went to heaven, she said, her small fingers tracing the total amount on the bill, Mom started working all the time, morning and night. She described how her mother would come home with aching feet, sometimes too tired to even take off her shoes before falling asleep. The girl's voice grew stronger as she talked about her little brother. He's still little, she explained, as if this fact alone carried special weight. He doesn't understand why his stomach hurts sometimes. She described how she'd been sharing her school lunches with him, carefully breaking each sandwich into 2 equal pieces, making sure he got the bigger half. From the gallery, someone quietly sniffled. The bailiff, a tough-looking man who had served in the courtroom for 15 years, suddenly became very interested in adjusting his tie, his eyes suspiciously moist. The girl went on to describe their empty kitchen cabinets, explaining how she'd watched them grow bare over the past weeks. She talked about the sound they made, hollow and empty, when she opened them hoping to find something, anything, they might have overlooked. They used to be full, she said. Dad liked to cook. He made the best pancakes. Her small frame told its own story. The dark circles under her eyes, the way her collarbones showed too prominently through her thin skin, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of too many missed meals. She didn't need to explain these things. They were visible to everyone in the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, noticing how the girl's sweater hung loose on her shoulders, how she had to keep pushing up sleeves that were far too long. He saw something in her eyes that shouldn't be there in someone so young. A kind of tired wisdom that came from carrying burdens meant for adults. When she finally talked about that morning at the store, her voice became almost apologetic. I know it's wrong to take things, she said, straightening her shoulders slightly. Dad always said we should be honest. Her voice wavered for the first time. But he also said I should take care of my little brother. The prosecutor, who had been standing ready to present the state's case, slowly sat back down. His legal pad remained untouched, his prepared arguments suddenly seeming irrelevant and cold in the face of this simple, honest testimony. The girl's mother sat in the back row, tears streaming silently down her face. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white, the raw redness of her fingers telling stories of endless hours of cleaning and serving, of a mother trying desperately to keep her family afloat. As the little girl finished speaking, she carefully refolded the hospital bill along its worn creases and slipped it back into her pocket. The simple action seemed to carry more weight than any closing argument ever could. In that moment, the case had become more than just a matter of stolen bread and cheese. It had become a mirror reflecting back the cracks in society that had led to this point. For the first time in his 20 years on the bench, the judge found himself at a loss for words. The weight of his robes, usually a reminder of his duty to uphold the law, now felt heavy with a different kind of responsibility. He removed his glasses slowly, placing them on the bench before him, a gesture that regular courtroom attendees had never seen before. His hands, steady through thousands of verdicts, trembled slightly as he picked up the case file. The sleeve of his robe brushed against the gavel, that simple wooden tool that had sealed the fate of so many who had stood before him. But today was different. Today, the law in its black and white clarity seemed to blur into shades of gray. The judge looked at his own reflection in the darkened computer screen on his bench. The face looking back at him was no longer just that of a judge, but of a father who had packed countless school lunches, of a grandfather who couldn't bear the thought of any child going hungry. His own childhood memories flooded back, of growing up in a neighborhood not unlike the one where this little girl lived, of watching his own mother stretch every dollar until it screamed. The courtroom remained silent, but it wasn't the usual tense silence that followed dramatic testimony. This silence felt different, heavier, filled with collective soul-searching. The morning light streaming through the high windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor, as if nature itself was marking this moment of decision. In the gallery, the usual crowd of lawyers waiting for their cases had stopped checking their phones. The court clerk had set aside her files. Even the ever-busy bailiff stood motionless, his usual stern expression softened by what he had witnessed. They all knew they were present for something unprecedented in this courtroom. The prosecutor, a man who had built his career on following the letter of the law, stood up slowly. His movement broke the stillness of the room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying an unusual note of emotion. "The state wishes to withdraw the charges." He paused, straightening his tie as if to ground himself. "But perhaps we can do more than just dismiss this case." The judge nodded, almost imperceptibly. In his mind, he was seeing beyond the single case before him, seeing all the other hungry children in his city, all the struggling single parents, all the empty kitchen cabinets behind closed doors. His years on the bench had taught him that sometimes justice needed to be about more than just following the law. He thought about all the cases he'd heard in this very room, the endless cycle of poverty, desperation, and crime. How many of those cases had started with empty stomachs and unpaid bills? How many people had stood before him simply because they had run out of options? The little girl still stood at the defendant's table, her borrowed dress now wrinkled from sitting. She looked even smaller now, dwarfed by the massive seal of justice on the wall behind her. But there was something in her posture, a quiet dignity, a strength that belied her years, that seemed to demand more than just legal judgment. The judge's mind went to his own granddaughter, safe at home with a full pantry and a college fund. The contrast twisted something in his chest. He thought about all the times he'd sent people to jail, believing he was upholding justice, never fully considering the circumstances that had brought them before him. From his elevated bench, he could see the girl's mother in the back row, her work uniform wrinkled from the long morning, her hands clasped in silent prayer. The woman's face bore the marks of endless worry, of too many sleepless nights, of the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones and stays there. The usual procedures and protocols suddenly seemed inadequate, almost laughable in the face of what had been revealed in his courtroom today. The judge realized that this moment called for something more than just a ruling. It called for a complete rethinking of what justice really meant. He reached for his glasses again, but instead of putting them on, he held them in his hands, turning them over slowly as he contemplated what to do next. The law was clear about theft, yes, but it was equally clear about justice, about equity, about the fundamental rights of every human being. As he gathered his thoughts, preparing to speak, he knew that whatever happened next would go far beyond the simple matter of a stolen loaf of bread. The judge's decision that day went far beyond the simple dismissal of charges. As he looked around his courtroom, he saw not just a legal proceeding, but an opportunity to address a deeper wound in the community. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a warmth that his regular courtroom visitors had never heard before. "This court," he began, his words measured and clear, "has seen thousands of cases. But sometimes it takes the courage of a child to make us see what's been in front of us all along." The little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The judge continued, each word carefully chosen. "Today, we're not just dealing with a single case of hunger. We're facing a challenge that affects our entire community." He turned to address the whole courtroom, his gaze sweeping across the gathered faces. The morning sun had shifted, casting warm light through the high windows, as if nature itself was highlighting this moment of change. "Starting today," he announced, "this court will establish a community food security program." The store owner, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. His face showed the conflict he'd been feeling since the moment he'd made the police call. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "I'd like to help. My store can serve as a collection point for food donations." The words seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders. The prosecutor, still standing, pulled out his phone. "I can contact the local food bank right now. We have resources that aren't being used effectively." His fingers moved quickly across the screen, already making connections, setting things in motion. A woman in the gallery, who turned out to be a social worker, raised her hand. "I know of at least 20 other families in similar situations," she said. "We need a systematic approach to help them." The judge nodded, gesturing for her to come forward and share her knowledge. The court clerk was already pulling up contact information for job training programs and social services. Her computer screen flickered with resources that had always existed but had never been properly connected. The bailiff, usually stoic and silent, mentioned that his church group could help organize regular food drives. The little girl's mother, watching from her seat, pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. But these weren't tears of desperation anymore. They were tears of hope, of seeing a community finally opening its eyes to a problem that had been invisible for too long. News of what was happening spread quickly through the courthouse. Lawyers delayed their own cases to stay and offer help. A real estate agent in the gallery offered to help find a space for a permanent food bank. Someone mentioned knowing a chef who could teach free cooking classes to help families stretch their food budgets. The judge ordered an immediate investigation into local food assistance programs, but not just to find their failures. He wanted to understand how to make them work better, how to reach the people who needed them most. His years of experience had taught him that system change required both understanding and action. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond the courthouse walls. Local newspapers picked up the story, not focusing on the attempted theft, but on the community's response to it. Television stations sent reporters to cover the opening of the new food bank. Social media buzzed with ways to help, connecting people who wanted to give with those in need. The little girl and her mother found themselves at the center of a movement they never expected. Their story became a catalyst for change, pushing people to look beyond their own comfortable lives and see the struggles of their neighbors. The mother was connected with job training programs that allowed her to find better-paying work with more flexible hours. The corner store transformed into a community hub, with the owner setting up a pay-it-forward system where customers could buy extra food for families in need. The shelves that had once been a source of temptation for a hungry child became a symbol of community support. 6 months later, the judge sat in his chamber, looking at a report on his desk. The new programs had already helped hundreds of families. But more importantly, they had changed the way people thought about their neighbors, about hunger, about community responsibility. The quiet courage of one small girl had awakened something in people, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that speak from the heart. 1 month after the courtroom incident, the little girl walked into her former elementary school, clutching her mother's hand. But this time, she wasn't heading to class. Instead, they were going to the school cafeteria, which had been transformed into something remarkable during after-school hours. The large space hummed with activity. Tables that usually held lunch trays now displayed fresh fruits, vegetables, and staple foods. The judge's community food program had chosen the school as one of its main distribution centers, knowing it was a place families already trusted. The cafeteria workers had volunteered to stay late, helping to organize and distribute food to families in need. The store owner, who had once called the police on the little girl, now stood behind one of the tables, showing parents how to make healthy meals on a budget. He'd become one of the program's most dedicated volunteers, turning his guilt into action. His corner store had transformed too, now featuring a community corner where customers could buy extra items for families in need. Her mother wasn't just collecting food anymore. She stood at a small desk near the entrance, helping other parents fill out forms for job training programs. The judge's initiative had connected her with a local community college, where she was learning computer skills in the evenings. Her hands still showed the signs of hard work, but her eyes sparkled with new hope. The school principal had noticed something else changing too. More students were coming to school well-fed and ready to learn. The number of children falling asleep in class had decreased dramatically. Teachers reported better attendance and improved concentration. What had started as one child's desperate act had rippled out to affect hundreds of young lives. Local businesses had started getting involved. A grocery store chain offered discounted prices for the food program. A transportation company provided free delivery services for elderly and disabled recipients. Even the high school students had joined in, creating a volunteer program to help distribute food and teach basic cooking skills to younger children. The little girl's brother, who once went to bed hungry, now helped sort donations after school. He was too young to fully understand the change his sister had sparked, but he knew that their kitchen cabinets were no longer empty. He proudly wore a volunteer badge, handing out apples and oranges to other kids his age. The courthouse staff had become regular volunteers too. The kind-eyed clerk who had once slipped the little girl a candy now organized a monthly donation drive among court employees. The bailiff's church group had adopted several families, ensuring they had not just food, but other necessities as well. Local news stations occasionally came by to cover the program's success, but they found more than just a food distribution center. They discovered a community coming together, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming friends over shared meals and shared stories. The cameras captured something that couldn't be measured in pounds of food or numbers of families served. They captured the restoration of human dignity. One quiet evening, as the little girl helped pack up the remaining food items, she found herself standing next to the judge. He had removed his court robes and wore a simple volunteer's apron. He knelt down to her level, just as he had done in the courtroom that day, but this time his eyes weren't filled with difficult decisions. They shone with pride. "Do you know what you did?" he asked softly, helping her fold up an empty cardboard box. "You didn't just take food that day. You took a stand. You showed us all what courage looks like." The little girl smiled shyly, not fully understanding the magnitude of the changes she had set in motion. As they locked up the cafeteria that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows through the windows. The empty room still echoed with the day's activities, the sound of children's laughter, parents' relieved sighs, and volunteers' cheerful conversations. What had once been a story of desperation had transformed into one of hope, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. 1 year had passed since that fateful day in the courtroom. The little girl stood in front of a crowd gathered in the city hall's main chamber, her new dress fitting properly this time. She wasn't here as someone in trouble. She was here as an honored guest. The city was celebrating the first anniversary of what they now called the Community Bridges Program. The program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started in one school cafeteria had spread to 30 locations across the city. The simple food distribution system had evolved into a comprehensive community support network. Families who had once needed help were now returning as volunteers, creating a beautiful cycle of giving back. The judge sat in the front row, no longer in his judicial robes, but in a regular suit. He watched as the little girl stepped up to the microphone, her voice stronger now, no longer trembling with hunger or fear. She had become the unexpected face of a movement that had changed their city's approach to poverty and hunger. In the audience sat familiar faces from that day in court. The prosecutor who had withdrawn the charges was now heading a legal aid clinic, helping other families navigate the system before they reached crisis points. The public defender had started a nonprofit organization connecting law firms with families in need of legal assistance. The store owner's small corner shop had become a model for other businesses. His community corner idea had spread to stores across the city, creating a network of support points where dignity and assistance went hand in hand. He even started teaching other store owners how to implement similar programs. The little girl's mother stood proudly at the back of the room, wearing a business casual outfit instead of a cleaning uniform. She had completed her computer training program and now worked as an administrative assistant at a local nonprofit, helping coordinate food distribution and job training programs. Her evenings were no longer spent cleaning offices, but helping her children with homework. Teachers from the elementary school shared remarkable statistics. School attendance had improved significantly. Test scores were up. Behavioral issues had decreased. But more importantly, they spoke of the intangible changes, the smiles on children's faces, the energy in their steps, the hope in their eyes. Local government officials announced new initiatives inspired by the program's success. The city had revised its emergency assistance policies, making them more accessible and efficient. Social services had been streamlined, with a focus on prevention rather than crisis management. The courthouse had established a special division dedicated to helping families find resources before their situations became desperate. The little girl's brother, now a year older and noticeably healthier, sat next to his sister on stage. He had started a kids' volunteer club at his school, teaching other children of community service and the importance of helping others. The small changes were adding up to big differences in young lives across the city. When the little girl finished her speech, she did something unexpected. She walked over to where the judge sat and handed him something, the hospital bill she had shown in court that day. But now it was marked paid in full. The community's support had helped her family not just with food, but with managing the overwhelming medical debt that had started their spiral into poverty. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, but it wasn't just for the little girl. It was for every volunteer, every donor, every person who had looked at their community differently after hearing her story. It was for the power of compassion over judgment, of understanding over punishment, of community over isolation. As the celebration continued, the little girl caught the judge's eye. They shared a knowing look, both understanding that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected places. Her simple act of taking food to feed her brother had exposed not just hunger, but the deep connections that bind a community together. Outside City Hall, the sun set on a changed city. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but the heart of the community beat differently now. In windows across town, small signs appeared. Neighbor helping neighbor, each one a reminder that no child should ever have to choose between honesty and hunger, between dignity and desperation.